Naomi Wallace, a trailblazing Black entrepreneur, boarded her first-class flight, ready to toast to her latest success, blissfully unaware that her journey would soon ignite a fierce battle for dignity in the skies. As the engines roared to life, a subtle tension thickened the air. Disdainful glances and whispered remarks from fellow passengers hinted at an unseen storm brewing. Just when Naomi thought she would soar above the clouds, a single, condescending act would trigger a powerful confrontation, challenging her very definition of respect and resilience. Naomi Wallace glanced down at her boarding pass, first class, seat 2A. It was the kind of seat she had once only dreamed of, a symbol of achievement that had come with years of grit, resilience, and countless long nights. She adjusted her blazer, a classic shade of navy that contrasted beautifully with her rich, dark skin. Her hair was styled in perfect waves, a crown for the occasion. Naomi was here to celebrate herself. The world often refused to, so she learned to take up that duty herself. As she stepped onto the plane, the familiar scent of fresh leather and faintly recycled air filled her senses. Naomi had flown many times, but first class was a rare treat, and she was determined to savor it. Yet the atmosphere shifted almost immediately. A small flicker of doubt crossed her mind when the flight attendant at the entrance greeted her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. Naomi noted the quick glance up and down, an unspoken question hanging in the air. "Welcome aboard, Ms." The attendant's voice trailed off as her gaze lingered just a bit too long on Naomi's attire, the faintest trace of surprise visible in her expression. Naomi offered a tight smile in return, trying to shrug it off. She'd come too far to let something as small as a half-hearted greeting ruin her mood. This was her day, her achievement, her celebration. Walking down the aisle, she felt the weight of stares resting on her, a mix of curiosity and something else, something faintly judgmental. It wasn't unusual. She was used to the questions, the sideways glances, the way strangers tried to fit her into boxes she simply didn't belong in. Naomi had built her company from the ground up, overcoming obstacles that had often seemed insurmountable. Yet here she was, facing the same skeptical glances. Naomi settled into her seat, arranging her things and smoothing down her blazer. She allowed herself a deep breath, silently repeating the mantras that had carried her through the toughest days of her life. "I am here because I deserve to be. I've earned this." Moments later, the attendant returned with a pre-flight drink, a flute of sparkling water with a single lime wedge floating at the top. Naomi noticed how the woman avoided meeting her eye, her smile polite but distant. "Thank you," Naomi replied, keeping her tone calm and steady. As she sipped her drink, Naomi couldn't help but notice the whispers from a few seats down. A well-dressed man, likely a businessman judging by his sleek briefcase and tailored suit, was glancing over at her with an expression that could only be described as disdainful. Naomi felt the familiar pang of annoyance, but she forced herself to remain calm. This was her moment, not theirs. Just as she was beginning to settle into the peace she'd come here for, a couple walked past her row, hesitating slightly as they took in her presence. The woman's lips pursed ever so slightly, her eyes flicking toward her partner, who shook his head as if to brush off some unsaid remark. They moved on, but the discomfort lingered, settling like a layer of dust Naomi couldn't quite brush off. A voice echoed over the intercom as the captain made his announcements. Naomi sat back, listening to the rhythmic tone of his voice, grounding herself in the familiar routine of flight preparations. She could almost feel her usual confidence returning, reminding her that these minor slights were nothing she hadn't faced before. After all, she hadn't made it this far. By letting every unkind glance or dismissive gesture break her stride. Yet, as the plane began its slow taxi toward the runway, Naomi's sense of unease only grew. She felt like an unwelcome guest at a party she had every right to attend. The realization settled heavily in her chest. She had come here to celebrate, but instead, she was finding herself caught in yet another battle, one she hadn't planned on fighting today. Naomi reached for her phone to put it on airplane mode, catching her reflection in the screen. She saw herself, a woman who had overcome, who had sacrificed, who had built something from nothing. And in that instant, she decided she would not shrink. The plane accelerated down the runway, the rumble of the engines growing louder, and Naomi tightened her grip on her armrest. It was a feeling she knew well, that fleeting moment of anticipation, the slight fear of what might go wrong, followed by the exhilaration of takeoff. She let the sound fill her ears, a reminder that she was strong, that she had soared above expectations before and would do so again. With the city lights disappearing below, Naomi leaned back and closed her eyes, trying to let go of the stares, the whispers, the cool indifference. She reminded herself that her journey wasn't about those who doubted her. It was about her own belief, her own sense of worth, her right to be exactly where she was. Little did she know, this would be one flight that would put her strength to the test in ways she hadn't anticipated. But for now, she settled in, steadying herself, ready for whatever turbulence lay ahead. The plane had reached cruising altitude, and Naomi opened her laptop, preparing to review some notes for her upcoming meetings. Work was often her refuge, a place where she could focus and feel valued for her contributions without the heavy shadow of judgment. She hoped that diving into her tasks might distract her from the unease that had already crept into her mind. But almost as soon as she settled in, another wave of subtle slights began. The flight attendants moved through the aisles, attending to passengers with quiet efficiency, but each time one passed by Naomi's seat, there was a distinct pause, a hesitation before they acknowledged her. When they finally did, their expressions were painfully neutral, as though she were a problem they were quietly hoping would solve itself. A young couple across the aisle whispered to each other, shooting occasional glances in Naomi's direction. She ignored them, focusing on her screen, but the noise was unmistakable, the faint murmurs punctuated by barely concealed stares. Naomi felt her hands clench on her keyboard, her jaw tightening as she fought the urge to say something. Not yet, she told herself. Don't give them the satisfaction. As the attendants began serving meals, Naomi braced herself. It was such a simple moment, something that should have been routine, insignificant, but even here, she could feel the tension building. When they reached her row, the flight attendant offered the meal with a polite but distant nod, her gaze sweeping over Naomi's tray as though she were an inconvenience. Naomi forced a smile. "Thank you," she replied, her voice steady, even as frustration simmered just below the surface. As she took a bite, she realized something felt off. Her meal was sloppily arranged, the sauce already smeared across the edges, the bread slightly squashed. It wasn't something most people would notice, but Naomi had long grown accustomed to the small ways people could communicate their disdain without words. It was subtle, but she knew. She could tell when someone was treating her differently, as though her very presence disturbed the order of their world. For a moment, she considered saying something, demanding that the attendant treat her with the same respect she had extended to the other passengers. But she hesitated, recalling the many times she'd faced similar situations, and the countless instances she'd chosen silence over confrontation to avoid escalating a situation. Naomi thought back to the countless times she'd been the only black woman in a boardroom, the only one who didn't quite fit the mold of what others thought she should be. She had built her business from the ground up, fighting for recognition and success in an industry that hadn't welcomed her easily. And yet, even here, on what should have been a day of rest and celebration, she found herself confronted with the same quiet battle she had faced her entire life. Her hands tightened around the edge of her tray, her knuckles whitening. "You're better than this, Naomi," she reminded herself. "You didn't get this far by letting every small slight break you." Yet, even as she tried to steady herself, the memories rushed back. Every instance when she'd been overlooked, every moment when she'd had to prove her worth to people who didn't think she belonged. Each glance, each whispered word, each dismissive smile layered onto the frustration bubbling inside her. Across the aisle, an older woman in pearls and an immaculate cream-colored blouse shifted in her seat, her gaze lingering on Naomi for just a second too long. There was a faint expression of disapproval, her lips tightening as if she'd smelled something unpleasant. Naomi looked away, feeling the familiar sting of isolation, a reminder that no matter how high she climbed, there would always be people ready to tear her down. Naomi leaned back, closing her laptop, The work she'd been trying to immerse herself in felt far away now, distant and unattainable. She took a deep breath, staring out the window into the vast, endless sky, trying to remind herself of who she was and what she had achieved. She thought of her family, her friends, the people who had believed in her when no one else had. She thought of the late nights, the early mornings, the sacrifices she had made to be here. But with each moment that passed, the pressure built, settling into her chest, a weight that refused to lift. She could almost feel herself shrinking under the combined weight of their stares, the silent judgment, the constant reminder that, in their eyes, she didn't belong. The meal service ended, and Naomi watched as the flight attendant moved through the rows, collecting trays with polite smiles and murmurs of thank you and hope you enjoyed your meal. When she reached Naomi's row, her smile disappeared, replaced with that same distant, almost clinical expression. As she collected the tray, Naomi's voice broke the silence. "Excuse me," she said, her tone steady but firm. The attendant looked at her, a faint flicker of surprise in her eyes. "Yes, ma'am." Naomi took a breath. "Was there something wrong with my meal?" The attendant blinked, momentarily caught off guard. I'm not sure what you mean," she replied, the smile plastered on her face now laced with unease. "Never mind," Naomi replied, her voice softer this time. "Forget it." The attendant quickly moved on, leaving Naomi alone with the lingering frustration, the feeling of being watched, judged, subtly pushed aside. As she settled back into her seat, Naomi knew one thing with clarity. This quiet aggression wasn't going to end here. But for now, she forced herself to remain composed. She would not let them see her break. She would hold her head high, even as the tension thickened, even as she felt her patience wearing thin. In the quiet of her own mind, a storm was brewing. But Naomi knew it wasn't time to release it. Not yet. Naomi had kept her composure throughout the flight, but each passing hour seemed to add weight to the simmering resentment. She kept reminding herself that she had endured worse, that this was just another hurdle to overcome, another moment that would pass. But deep down, Naomi felt her patience stretching thin, like a rubber band pulled to its breaking point. As the flight attendants prepared for the final meal service, Naomi noted the air around her thickening with tension. There was something unsettling in the way they moved, a barely hidden discomfort that set her on edge. The attendant from earlier approached with a tray, balancing a covered dish that didn't look like the careful plating she'd seen served to others around her. "Here you go, Ms. Wallace," the attendant said, her tone dripping with artificial politeness, her eyes avoiding Naomi's. She set the tray down with a smile that seemed almost mocking. Naomi's eyes shifted to the plate. Her food looked hastily assembled, the garnish messy, the presentation sloppy compared to the carefully arranged dishes she'd glimpsed on other trays. It was a small detail, but the deliberate disrespect in it was unmistakable. Her chest tightened as she registered the meal before her, a clear, final straw in an already tense journey. "Is there a problem?" the attendant asked, the faintest trace of amusement in her eyes as she caught Naomi's reaction. Her tone was patronizing, as if she were speaking to a child who didn't understand the nuances of fine dining. Naomi stared at the plate, taking a long, steady breath. She could feel her pulse quicken, her patience unraveling, and the years of restraint she'd practiced to survive in boardrooms, meetings, and countless interactions began to crumble. She looked up, meeting the attendant's gaze head-on, and the woman's smirk faltered ever so slightly. "Actually, there is," Naomi replied, her voice calm but brimming with a suppressed intensity. "I can't help but notice that my meal looks a little different than everyone else's." The attendant's face flushed, and she shifted, struggling to hold Naomi's gaze. "I assure you, ma'am, we treat all our passengers equally." Naomi let out a bitter laugh, finally allowing herself to confront the lie in the attendant's words. "Equally?" she repeated, her voice rising slightly. "Is that what you call this?" Her words seemed to pierce through the air, breaking the polite silence of the cabin. Several passengers turned to look, their eyes widening as they took in the scene. Naomi was no longer willing to ignore the whispers, the glances, the carefully hidden scorn that had surrounded her from the moment she'd boarded. She stood up, her head held high, and addressed the cabin. "I want to make one thing very clear," she began, her voice carrying a strength that demanded attention. "I am here in this seat because I have earned it. I am a successful, self-made woman, and I have every right to be here. I do not deserve this disrespect, not from the flight crew, and certainly not from anyone else on this plane." A ripple of shock moved through the passengers. The whispers and stares quieted, replaced by a stunned silence. Naomi felt the weight of every eye on her, and she used it, drawing on the power that had driven her to build her business, to overcome countless barriers. She would not be reduced to their expectations, to the limited box they wanted to confine her in. "For those of you who may have wondered why I'm in this seat, let me enlighten you," Naomi continued, her tone unwavering. "I am the CEO and founder of a multi-million-dollar company. I employ hundreds of people. I've built my life through hard work and perseverance, and I refuse to let anyone diminish me." She directed her gaze toward the flight attendant, whose face had drained of color. "And you," Naomi said, her voice like steel, "will treat me with the respect I deserve." The cabin was silent, and for a moment, Naomi could feel the full weight of her words settle over the space. Her declaration was undeniable, powerful, and it left no room for argument. In the midst of the stillness, a passenger near the back spoke up, his voice hesitant but clear. "She's right. That treatment was uncalled for." Another passenger murmured agreement, nodding as they looked at Naomi with newfound respect. Naomi could see the shift happening, a wave of recognition moving through the cabin. People were finally seeing her for who she was, a powerful, accomplished woman who would not be diminished. The flight attendant seemed frozen, her previous smugness replaced by visible discomfort. Naomi took a deep breath, letting the energy of her stand wash over her, filling her with a renewed sense of pride and self-worth. She'd faced countless obstacles before, but standing up like this, declaring her worth in front of strangers, felt like a victory she hadn't known she needed. Finally, Naomi sat back down, still feeling the intensity of her words vibrating in her chest. She allowed herself a small, private smile as she looked out the window, watching the vast expanse of sky beyond. She had taken back her peace, reclaimed her dignity, and the stares of those around her no longer mattered. She knew who she was, and she wouldn't let anyone take that away from her. The flight continued, the atmosphere in the cabin transformed, the silent message of Naomi's defiance lingering in the air. For the first time, she felt a true sense of belonging, not because of anyone else's validation, but because she had claimed it for herself. As the plane sailed through the clouds, Naomi felt a surprising calm settle over her. The silence that followed her declaration was profound. For the first time during the flight, she wasn't aware of stares or whispers. Instead, there was a quiet respect that filled the air around her. She let herself relax, finally feeling as though she had reclaimed her own space. But the calm didn't last long. A few minutes later, the lead flight attendant approached her row. Naomi noticed the woman's rigid posture and guarded expression, as though she were bracing for a confrontation. Naomi met her gaze directly, refusing to shrink under the weight of the woman's scrutiny. "Ms. Wallace," the attendant began, her voice carefully measured, "the captain has requested a word with you." Naomi's eyebrows rose in surprise. "Is there a problem?" The woman hesitated, clearly unsure how much to say. "If you wouldn't mind following me to the front of the cabin," she replied, avoiding the question. Naomi felt the tension return, coiling in her chest. She unbuckled her seatbelt, gathered herself, and rose from her seat. As she followed the attendant, she could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her. Once again, but this time, she didn't let it bother her. She walked with purpose, with strength, and without a trace of the unease she'd felt earlier. At the front of the plane, near the cockpit, the captain was waiting for her. He was a tall, silver-haired man with a calm, serious demeanor, his face unreadable as he regarded her. "Ms. Wallace," he began, his tone formal, "I understand there was a disturbance in the cabin." Naomi held her chin high, refusing to let him intimidate her. "If you're referring to me standing up for myself, then yes," she replied. There was a disturbance. "I don't tolerate disrespect, and I shouldn't have to." The captain's gaze softened slightly, but his expression remained firm. "I understand. I apologize if you felt mistreated by the crew," he said, his voice lowering. "But I have to ask that we keep the peace for the remainder of the flight." Naomi took a slow breath, her mind racing. She could see the captain was trying to de-escalate the situation, to restore order without fully addressing the deeper issue. But this wasn't about avoiding conflict anymore. It was about standing up for what was right, for herself, and for anyone else who'd been made to feel small in situations like this. "Captain, I'm more than willing to keep the peace," Naomi replied, her voice unwavering. "But that requires mutual respect. I didn't pay for this seat to be treated as less than, and I won't tolerate that from anyone, not even your crew." There was a long silence as her words settled between them. The captain seemed to struggle for a response, and Naomi could sense the tension in his stance, the silent acknowledgement of her point. After a moment, he nodded. "I hear you, Ms. Wallace. I'll have a word with the crew," he said, his tone softening. "If there's anything you need for the remainder of the flight, please don't hesitate to let me know." Naomi felt a small sense of relief at his words, a tentative shift toward understanding. "Thank you, Captain. That's all I ask." She returned to her seat, feeling a renewed sense of calm. The captain's response hadn't been a complete resolution, but it was a step, a small victory in a larger battle. She could see the flight attendant from earlier watching her as she settled back in, her expression now cautious, almost apologetic. The rest of the flight passed in relative quiet. Naomi could feel the subtle change in atmosphere, a newfound respect from the crew and a shift in the attitudes of those around her. There was no more whispering, no more disdainful glances. Instead, people seemed almost reluctant to meet her eyes, as though they were finally seeing her as an equal. When the plane began its descent, Naomi allowed herself a deep breath, feeling the tension of the journey begin to lift. She looked out the window, watching the lights of the city below as they drew closer to the ground. She knew this experience would stay with her, that the memory of this quiet battle would fuel her in the days to come. As the plane touched down, Naomi felt a renewed determination settle within her. She had faced yet another moment of disrespect, but she hadn't let it define her. She had reclaimed her dignity, her worth, and her peace. When the cabin doors opened, Naomi gathered her belongings and prepared to disembark. As she stepped into the aisle, she felt a gentle tap on her shoulder. She turned to find one of the passengers from earlier, a middle-aged woman with a kind expression, looking at her with admiration. "Thank you," the woman said quietly, "for standing up for yourself. I think we all needed to see that." Naomi felt a warmth spread through her chest, a sense of validation she hadn't been expecting. She nodded, offering the woman a small smile. "Sometimes, we have to remind people of who we are," Naomi replied, her voice steady, "and that we belong, no matter where we are." The woman gave her a knowing look, nodding in agreement. As Naomi exited the plane, she felt a new sense of purpose, a renewed commitment to continue fighting for her place, and for the place of others who might not yet have the strength to stand as tall as she had. Outside the airport, she stepped into the warm air, feeling the weight of the journey lift from her shoulders. Naomi knew she'd face more battles in the future, but for now, she let herself bask in the small but significant victories she had won. And as she walked toward her car, she felt more powerful, more whole, and more determined than ever to continue standing tall. Naomi's driver was waiting just outside the airport, and she climbed into the car with a quiet sigh of relief. The city lights stretched out before her as they drove toward her villa, an oasis of calm she'd planned to escape to for her celebration. The night felt full of quiet promise, a reward after the tension she had endured in silence for so long. But tonight, she would savor her small triumph. As they neared the villa, her phone buzzed with a message. It was from her close friend and business partner, Clara. Clara had been a loyal companion from the beginning, a woman who understood Naomi's journey because she'd lived a similar one. "Hey Naomi, just wanted to check in. How was the flight? Ready to celebrate?" Naomi smiled at the message. She knew Clara would be proud of her, but she wanted to save the details for when they met in person. Tonight, she'd allow herself to relax, to let go of the weight she'd been carrying and focus on her accomplishments. Her villa was nestled in a quiet part of the city, a modern but warm space with panoramic views of the ocean. As she stepped inside, she felt a sense of peace wash over her. She poured herself a glass of wine and walked out onto the balcony, letting the sea breeze calm her. The moonlight illuminated the waves below, casting a gentle glow over the water. She stood there for a long time, sipping her wine, reflecting on her journey. She thought back to her childhood, growing up with little and dreaming of a life that had once seemed so far out of reach. Her parents had worked tirelessly to give her opportunities they'd never had, and she had carried their hopes, their sacrifices, with her through every achievement, every setback. Her mind drifted back to the faces of the people on the plane, the passengers who had stared at her with disdain, and the ones who had looked away in silent agreement with her stand. She realized that her decision to speak out hadn't been just for her own dignity. It was for everyone who had ever felt like they didn't belong, like they weren't worthy of respect. Naomi knew she wasn't just claiming her place in that first-class seat. She was opening doors, even if quietly, for those who would come after her. As she let her mind wander, her phone buzzed again. This time, it was a message from someone unexpected, a young woman named Jordan, a junior executive who'd recently started at her company. Jordan had looked up to Naomi for years, seeing her as a role model, as proof that hard work and determination could lead to a seat at the table. "Ms. Wallace," the message began, "I just wanted to say thank you. I saw a video that someone posted from your flight tonight. I know you must have been uncomfortable, but seeing you stand up for yourself, it gave me the courage to do the same someday." Naomi's eyes widened as she reread the message. A video? She hadn't realized that someone had been recording. In her mind, it had been a private moment, something that, while important, was a part of her own quiet battles. But the idea that her stand had reached others, that it could ripple outward and inspire, filled her with a surprising sense of pride. She replied to Jordan, her heart full. "Thank you for telling me. Remember, you don't have to wait for someday. The world needs your courage right now. You belong, Jordan, and don't let anyone make you feel otherwise." After she sent the message, Naomi felt a deep sense of purpose settle within her. She realized that her journey wasn't just about her own accomplishments or survival. It was about creating space for those who needed someone to lead the way, to show them that they didn't have to hide or diminish themselves to fit in. The next morning, Naomi woke with the dawn, the light casting a golden glow over her villa. She poured herself a cup of coffee and settled into a chair on the balcony, feeling the warmth of the rising sun on her face. She didn't know what lay ahead, but she felt a new determination. With her laptop open, she began jotting down notes, new ideas for her company, ways to improve mentorship programs, ideas for better support networks for women and minorities in the workplace. This wasn't just about building her own empire. It was about using her influence to change the landscape for others. She would make her company a place where people like Jordan would never have to second-guess their worth. As she worked, her mind kept returning to the look on that flight attendant's face, the shocked silence of the cabin. For too long, she'd endured such moments quietly, brushing them off to keep the peace. But no more. She realized that her voice was one of her greatest assets, not just in the boardroom but in every sphere of her life. Naomi smiled as she closed her laptop, feeling a sense of readiness for whatever was next. The days ahead would bring more challenges, more moments of discomfort, but she knew now that she had the strength to face them. She had claimed her place in the world, and she wasn't afraid to let it be known. For Naomi Wallace, this was just the beginning. She had fought to get here, and she would keep fighting, not just for herself, but for everyone who needed someone to show them the way forward. A few days later, Naomi was back in her office, preparing for the launch of a new project. It was an initiative close to her heart, an entrepreneurship program aimed at providing funding and mentorship for young women and minorities. Her phone buzzed constantly with messages from her team, but one email caught her eye. The subject line read, "Your story has inspired us." Curious, she opened it. The message was from a young black woman named Elise, an aspiring entrepreneur who had been struggling to get her business off the ground. Elise explained that she had seen the video of Naomi's stand on the flight. The video had circulated widely on social media, sparking conversations about discrimination, resilience, and the power of standing up for oneself. Elise wrote about how she'd almost given up on her business dreams, feeling that the obstacles she faced were insurmountable. But seeing Naomi's courage had rekindled her hope. "Thank you for showing me that I deserve a place at the table, too," Elise had written. Naomi felt a swell of emotion as she read. What had started as a painful experience had turned into something transformative, not just for her, but for others. She realized that her journey wasn't just personal. It was becoming a collective one. The decision to stand up for herself had resonated in ways she hadn't anticipated, inspiring people she'd never met. "It's amazing how one moment can have an impact far beyond what we imagine," she murmured to herself. Her assistant, David, entered the room, holding a tablet. "Ms. Wallace, you might want to see this," he said, gesturing toward the screen. The tablet displayed an article from a major business publication. The headline read, "CEO Naomi Wallace sparks nationwide conversation on bias and belonging." It was a thoughtful piece discussing the broader implications of her stand on the flight, including interviews with social justice advocates, other business leaders, and individuals from various backgrounds who felt empowered by Naomi's story. Naomi scanned the article, noticing the quotes from people who'd been inspired to speak up in their own lives. The publication had even included a few stories of people standing up to microaggressions in their workplaces, citing her actions as a catalyst for their courage. She felt a mix of humility and pride. This was the impact she'd always dreamed of having, the reason she'd worked so tirelessly to build her career, not just to be successful, but to create lasting change. "David," Naomi said, a spark of excitement in her voice, "let's build on this momentum. I want to host a town hall, something open to the public, where we can discuss these issues openly." David nodded, already making notes. "Do you have a location in mind?" "Yes," she replied, thinking about her company's headquarters, which had a large, welcoming atrium. "Let's make it here. I want it to feel like home, a place where anyone can feel comfortable enough to speak their truth." In the days that followed, word about the event spread quickly. People from all walks of life registered to attend, eager to join a conversation that felt both timely and deeply personal. Naomi received countless messages of support, some from people she admired, including other prominent CEOs, advocates, and even public figures. Each message was a reminder of the ripples her actions had set in motion. On the day of the town hall, Naomi stood at the front of the atrium, feeling a mix of excitement and anticipation. The room was packed with people, some standing, others seated, their eyes filled with a sense of urgency. She recognized Elise in the crowd, the young woman who'd written to her days before, and she gave her a small nod of encouragement. Naomi stepped up to the microphone, pausing to let the crowd settle. "Thank you all for being here," she began, her voice steady but warm. "This conversation is long overdue. Too often, we are told to endure quietly, to keep our heads down and avoid making waves. But we all deserve respect, no matter who we are or where we come from." Her words resonated through the room, and she could see nods of agreement ripple through the crowd. "I started my journey thinking that success was simply about working hard and proving myself," she continued. "But along the way, I realized that true success means creating space for others to succeed as well. Today, I want to hear your stories, because each of you has a voice, and every voice matters." One by one, people stepped forward to share their experiences. Some spoke about discrimination in the workplace, while others shared personal stories of resilience. Naomi listened intently, absorbing each story with a mixture of empathy and determination. This was why she had fought so hard. For moments like these, where people could come together, find strength in one another, and foster a sense of belonging. When it was Elise's turn to speak, she took a deep breath, her voice trembling slightly as she shared her journey. "I was close to giving up on my dreams," she admitted, looking directly at Naomi. "But seeing you stand up for yourself gave me the courage to keep going. You made me believe that I, too, deserve a place at the table." Naomi felt a surge of pride as she listened, her heart full. This was more than she had ever hoped to accomplish. Not just a successful career, but a legacy of empowerment, a reminder to others of their worth and strength. The town hall stretched long into the evening, and by the time the last person had spoken, Naomi felt a profound sense of gratitude. She had dreamed of making a difference, but witnessing the impact of her actions firsthand left her in awe. As the crowd began to disperse, Elise approached her, a grateful smile on her face. "Thank you for everything, Ms. Wallace," she said quietly. Naomi placed a hand on her shoulder, meeting her gaze. "Please call me Naomi, and remember, you belong here just as much as anyone else." Elise's smile widened, and Naomi could see the strength blossoming in her eyes, a reminder of the power one person's courage could spark in another. As Naomi left the atrium that night, she knew her journey was far from over. But she walked away with a renewed sense of purpose, knowing that she wasn't just a lone figure fighting for her place. She was part of a movement, one she would continue to build, one story at a time. In the end, Naomi's stand on that flight had become more than a single moment. It was the start of a legacy of resilience, respect, and empowerment that would endure long after her. And as she looked out over the city skyline that night, she knew that she was exactly where she was meant to be.
Don't forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel so we can keep bringing you the best stories.